Another one that comes to mind is the Coronado Shores. So just south from the Hotel Del. I'd love to hear about what did that used to be, before the 10 buildings of the Shores, and how did that come into place?
Well, the story of that is, pretty interesting, because, Larry Lawrence bought the Hotel Del just to get that land. He didn't really care about the Hotel Del. Once he had it, he liked being a hotelier, but
Right.
that wasn't his purpose. He was a real estate developer. So he bought that with the sole idea of developing that land, because he was a developer. When I was young, that was our like secret, not so secret, but that was where you could go as a kid and do just about anything and without any worry. So I mean, you could drink, you could do what I mean. It didn't make any difference because there was no access to it. It was just there was big dunes, I mean big heavy sand dunes. So the only way you could get there was if you were actually on the beach coming from the Hotel Del side. But where it's the Shores now, that was all big, tall sand dunes with no access to get in there whatsoever. So of course, kids, that's where we would drag kegs of beer, and what have you, when we were younger, without any fear, because we knew that there was no cops that were going to come up and over up and over the sand dunes. And to give you an idea how different things were, back then, I used to have a van, and so we would watch the sunset every day. So at sunset, I would drive across where what's the little street there, right between the Shores. Anyway, I would drive right onto the beach and drive down to IB and drive back, and we'd watch the sunset,
Right.
And drink a beer without anybody ever caring. I mean, Coronado was a place back in the 60s and even the 70s that we had the bike races. I mean, that's a subject all on itself. I mean, the cops would actually, not you had underage kids drinking and racing bikes, going from place to place to see who could drink as much beer and ending up with a great big huge beer party. I mean, only in Coronado this is unthinkable today.
Right.
But back then, I mean, you'd literally have hundreds of kids, and I think somebody just did an article on that. Joe just did an article on that, and I tell you, I participated in those. I mean, only in Coronado could I think of, in that era. And of course, now that wouldn't be possible.
Now, were the majority of people? What was the sentiment like about the Shores going in? Were they for that development, and was that a desirable place once they did go in? Did people want to live there?
A lot of people thought it was insane. They thought it was stupid. They didn't really understand. I mean, how could a lot of people didn't like it. A lot of people just didn't care. I mean, it didn't have the impact like the bridge did. I mean, the bridge was a galvanizing, thing. A lot of people had real strong feelings against it, but I remember just more of people going, "What the heck are they doing? Why would we build?" I mean, in Coronado. I mean, back then, we didn't have any. I mean, it was Coronado for the most part looked quite a bit different than it does today. I mean, this was a community that was built as a resort, so mostly it was single story, little cottages and bungalows. In fact, in the country club area, you couldn't even have a second story. I mean, it was against the CC&Rs.
Right.
So the size and the bulk and the mass of Coronado was like half of what it is today back then, because you didn't have any of these great big houses. Only the few old mansions that you'll see today that it's obvious those houses have been there for a long time, but most of those we all know where there was. But in an average block in Coronado, it was uncommon to even see, a two-story house except in a few neighborhoods. So here all of a sudden come these high-rises in the Shores, and there was a lot of controversy, a lot of mixed feeling.
And then the K's came in around that same time, or shortly after that. The Coronado K's just a little bit more down the Strand. What was the Strand just a barren place as well, where you guys would ride your bikes down and hang out there and have some views across the bay, or what were the K's like before those got built?
Well, I'll give you an example. When I was in high school, hazing was quite the thing. You were going to get hazed. That's all there was to it. And one of the favorite things was to catch the kids and take them down and drop them off down there, cut off all their hair. Sometimes take all their clothes, the stuff like that, and leave them down there. It was barren. I can remember. Sometimes you wouldn't see a car for 3. I mean, believe it or not, you wouldn't see a car for 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes.
Wow.
There was very little traveled. There was when I was a kid, when I was in high school, you go down to the end of IB, and before where the trolley is now, before where Highway 5 is. I mean, by the way, I remember when there wasn't even a Highway 5, but there was a liquor store there. Okay, they were talking about right at the other end of Imperial Beach, and the pavement ended right there. We used to take guns and we go shooting about a mile from right there because we could, because there was nobody, there was nothing, there was no South Bay like you know it today. Chula Vista was that big back. There was only the old Chula Vista. There was no East Lake. There was none of that stuff. So you had very little traffic that came up the Strand or even down the Strand. And I mean, if you go way back, I mean, the Strand was even narrower. When I was a kid, there was no barrier in between. The roadway, the two roadways were next to each other. Okay. So there was a lot of there was a lot of deaths. There was a lot of bad accidents on the Strand because, of course, that was the way to Tijuana.
And did water ever come up over that area, or was this a long time ago? I mean, in your history, did water ever come over?
Only a few times in some really unusual, when I was very young. Okay. But they kept building. The Strand of today is much different than the old Strand, and especially probably the Strand a couple of decades before I was born was a totally different. I mean, it was very, very narrow. That was quite often.
And not as much beach, too. I mean, I know they dredged.
There was very little.
They dredged San Diego Bay and dumped a lot of that sand along the ocean and all the way down.
Right.
South.
If you look at old pictures, you will see where the golf course is now. There was no golf course.
Right.
I mean, if you look at old pictures and you see the outline of Coronado, the outline today looks quite a bit different than the natural outline. Okay. I mean, we filled in the Spanish Bight. We filled in the whole beach.
Right.
Okay. We filled in the whole golf course. So what didn't we fill? I mean, we probably got. I would imagine we probably had to increase the land mass probably at least 30%, maybe more. I mean, quite a bit from the old, right. Coronado Island, and North Island, so it's South Island and
right.
North Island. So.
Wow, yeah. Wow. We talked a little bit about your kind of military beginnings. Was Coronado more of a military town back then? 50s, 60s, 70s, and is it the same type of military town today as far as people or patriotism, or just when people describe Coronado, when I mention that I live here, they say, oh, it's a military town. I say, well, kinda, but was it more so back then?
That's a good question. When I was a kid, it was a total military town. Coronado was as I said, there was times that it was cheaper to rent or own a house in Coronado than it was in San Diego. Mm-hmm. The prices were not what they are today, even remotely. We had lots of enlisted men that lived in Coronado. So we had sailors, that lived all over Coronado. We had the Navy projects where Lowe's is now. That was all Navy housing. And so it was a decidedly Navy town. We had the shore patrol. You could go through Coronado on any weekend night, and I'll tell you what you're always going to see. You're going to see the shore patrol. That's how many Navy personnel were out on the streets.
Wow.
In Coronado. Now that changed, of course, as they found out, and Coronado became a much more upscale place. But as far as is it still a Navy town, I believe it is. People here are unabashedly patriotic. I mean, the 4th of July has to be seen to be believed, in Coronado. I grew up that way. All my friends grew up that way. The flag's flying every day at my house, and so yes, it's still, I think, a very much a Navy town, but not the way it was before. Okay. It's just changed.